right. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to interact with our students. Last couple? Okay, I'm not mic'd, so I'm using my coach's voice. So I apologize if it feels like I'm shouting at you. So my name's Amy. I talked to you at the very beginning, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to John Bunker. So I have been really fortunate to get to know John over the past 2 years through the various Apple Exploring groups that I've gotten to interact with. John is visiting us from Palermo, Maine, where he's an orchardist, gardener, artist. John's an amazing artist and Apple historian. He's the founder of Fedco Trees and the Maine Heritage Orchard in Unity, Maine. John's mentored dozens of individuals through the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association Apprenticeship Program. So there's a lot of overlap with what John does with what we do with eBio 1250. So many Apple explorers across North America have benefited from John's deep knowledge about apples. I personally really appreciate John's enthusiasm, encouragement, and continued efforts to help folks learn about historic cultivars, growing practices, and enter into community together. So wherever John is, there's people. So it's a wonderful thing. So John's most recent book is Apples and the Art of Detection, and is a wonderful peek into the world of apple exploration and the steps he takes in identifying old cultivars. This book is full of his beautiful illustrations, so please be sure to check it out. I think we have my copy on the table over there. So we're grateful to have John here today and shall share his apple explorations with us. So please join me in welcoming John Bunker.
I was just, can you hear me okay back there? I was just staring at the wall while Amy was talking, and it said, what causes species to go extinct? So that's kind of relevant, we'll say. So thank you, Amy, and thank you, Katie. Actually, I have something for Katie. Katie, come on up for a second. We at the Maine Heritage Orchard, we do a calendar every year, and usually they're photographs. Have any of you heard of William Mullen, the Palm Queen? Yeah, so if you don't, go on Instagram, look up Palm Queen, POMME_Queen. He does the photographs for our calendars usually, but this year, they're my paintings.
Oh, they are.
And I thought you should have one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Lisa, too, and everybody at the museum here, and of course the Boulder Apple Tree Project, and probably especially all of you guys who came here and to hear me speak. Hopefully you'll be happy when you're left that you came. And if not, too bad, right? So I'm not going to do a PowerPoint. And so that's the way it goes. But I'm going to start by reading a poem. And the poem is written by a Sufi Persian poet from 500 years ago or so, and his name is Hafiz, and it's called "An Apple Tree Was Concerned." And the poem was introduced to me by a friend who's an orchardist in Massachusetts named Linda Hoffman, and I personally loved the poem. An apple tree told me it was concerned about a late frost and losing its gifts that could help feed a poor family close by. And then there were the jams and lots of apple butter that could be made in a banner crop year when the clouds were generous with what fell from them, and the sun rationed itself with precision. They could speak, trees. They could tell the sweetest things and can even tell a joke. But it takes special ears to hear them, ears that have listened to people with great care. So I grew up in Henry David Thoreau's hometown of Concord, Mass, with a small brook in the backyard and a river not very far away, and a several-acre patch of woods between me and my best friend's house. So I spent my early life building things out of logs and branches, entertaining myself around the neighborhood with the pine trees and the skunk cabbage, and occasionally Oreo cookies stuffed in my pocket as my only companions. Until 1960, when my parents relocated to California, and much to my chagrin, they took me with them. I was not quite 10. Though the river and the woods were now gone, the grassy hillsides of Palo Alto were still unsettled and fun to roam. The hillsides with their amazing live oak trees had not yet been turned into computer think tanks and housing developments, though the open land was already being gobbled up. It was clear, even to a 10-year-old, that the writing was on the wall. When I was 11, I was invited by family friends to return east and visit a lake in Maine. I went. Maine was a state that had missed out on much of modern civilization back in 1962. After being stripped of its timber in the 19th century, it was largely abandoned. The loggers left for the big woods in Michigan and Wisconsin. The farmers left for Ohio, Indiana, and most everybody else left for the factories in Lowell, Manchester, Providence, and other points south. So when I arrived that summer, it was a rather quiet place with a scattering of old farms, the occasional sawmill, or a small store selling fishing and hunting licenses, postcards, milk, pound packages of dried beans, and a makeshift post office along the back wall. The lake itself and the woods that surrounded the lake was, for me, instant paradise. A day or two into my vacation, I was out on the water with my friend, and I thought, this is it. So the damage was done. I was hooked on the Northeast, and I was hooked on the woods. I was given an opportunity, and looking back, I guess you could say, without really even knowing what I was doing, I responded to a call. I spent the next 6 years conniving ways to return to Maine every summer. And though I enjoyed my winters in the Bay Area, it was the 60s after all, an interesting time to be a short distance from San Francisco. But as soon as I could, I left the Bay Area for good, went to college in Waterville, Maine, and 4 years later, settled an hour's drive from that lake with several friends in a patch of woods not so different from those in Concord. Although we arrived knowing next to nothing, we cut the trees and built 5 small log cabins like Honest Abe. And we built barns and sheds and outhouses, and we created gardens and learned how to grow food, cut our firewood, and preserve the harvest for winter. I've been on that property now for 50 years and about 7 months. Not many of us anymore have the opportunity to live and experience one place year after year and decade after decade. It has given me a chance to get to know and especially to care for the same place for half a century. I climb in apple trees that I planted when they were the size of broomsticks. I weed in gardens that were once rocks and roots and stumps. As they were in my childhood, the plants are my companions and my teachers. I imagine them speaking to me as I pass by, and I wonder if they can hear my reply. Or is it just my imagination? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Either way, it's been an opportunity to develop a relationship with the plants. Or maybe it's my responsibility to do so. Or maybe it's both. When I moved to the land, as we called it, most people around town no longer farmed. Many were retired and at home with their kids, who were my parents' age and worked in town. Their kids, my 20-something contemporaries, were mostly gone altogether. Like the loggers and the farmers before them, they left the state for something better. I, on the other hand, became intrigued and then obsessed with the ancient apple trees, those small farm orchards of a dozen trees at most that still grew in nearly every dooryard in town. Fortunately, since there had been so little development, there had also been little incentive to tidy up the past. You just let it be and die gracefully. The barns slowly melted, and then one day in the spring, they collapsed under the weight of the winter snow. The fields grew in with gray birch and aspen, what we call popple in Maine, followed by gigantic branchy white pines. The apple trees, though, weren't cut down. They weren't developed like I've just learned here in Boulder, where so many thousands of the apple trees have been cut because of the development. But there was no development, or very little. So the apple trees stayed. They were left. They were left just abandoned. The apple trees lapsed into a sort of benign stasis, producing an inch or two at most of annual terminal growth, while shedding the occasional dead limb. And then in a good mast year, or banner year, as Hafiz put it, covering all the lawns around town with carpets of apples that I'd never seen before. I thought there was just two kinds, red and green. Like chili, right? Red and green. But then I learned there was something else, right? Every imaginable shape, size, color. How could I resist? I collected the apples and I began to wonder about the names. Eventually, I sought out old-timers who became my mentors. I hung out with the over 80s crowd, as I used to call them. They're all dead now, but they were glad to teach me a lot before they left. My love of apples grew quickly. There were more apples than anyone could ever need. I had to invent ways to use them. In those days, there were still half a dozen commercial cider presses within an hour of my home. Big, noisy contraptions with belts slapping and conveyors that took your apples high up through a little window into the upstairs, where the grinder showered the pumice down onto the cheese. I loved going to the old presses. I would poke through everybody else's apples as I waited my turn. I didn't care if it took all day to press 2 barrels. For a while, I even had a business, pressing barrels and selling fresh juice to you. I delivered it to your house, and then I helped you set up your barrel and even supplied you with an airlock and a wooden tap. One year, I should say that I sold a barrel to a friend, and he didn't bother to put the airlock in. And when you bung them up, especially if you're going to move them, then you got to bung them up good and tight. And one day they were having dinner, and they heard this gigantic kaboom. And the barrel, if you know your apple barrels, the staves on the ends are like in a line, they're all only, whatever, two inches wide or whatever. And it had blown out the end of the barrel, expelled half the juice all over his basement, and then had sucked in the barrel staves again so that you could see a crack across them. And then they were raised out about, maybe 3/8 of an inch. But it was still usable. That's how much pressure there was when it blew it out and then sucked it back in. But even cider pressing couldn't use up all the apples that I was collecting, so I built a root cellar out of cement and stone. It was small, but it worked elegantly. I could fit all my carrots, beets, potatoes, cabbage, turnips, kohlrabi, apples, and cider in it. I could keep the temperature below 40, above 32, with a humidity close to 90%. Harvest the food, put it in a box, set it on the shelf, close the double doors, and that was all there was to it. When the shelves begin to rot from all that moisture after every 2 or 3 years, replace them. The root cellar is one of the greatest of all human inventions and the most important structure on the farm after the barn. The comfortable house can wait. I then decided that I should grow my own apple trees. Gleaning from others was fun, but I needed to have my own. A friend was planting a small commercial orchard. I helped him dig holes one long day, and he gave me an armload of trees as a thank you. I planted them at my place, and they all did poorly. What was I doing wrong? I must be doing something wrong, but what? I thought about the old trees in the neighbors' yards, the Northern Spies, the Tolman Sweet, the Baldwins. Those trees were easily 100 years old. They seemed fairly happy and certainly incredibly rugged and well adapted. They'd been through it all. Maybe I should plant them. Somewhere along the way, somebody told me about grafting and the difference between grafted trees and seedlings. So of course I had to learn how to do it myself. A lot of stuff had begun to fall into place. Maybe I should graft these old local varieties, plant them in my yard and see how they did. So I dug up apple seedlings in the abandoned fields along our road, transported them down to our place in my wheelbarrow, and planted them wherever I could find a spot deep enough to dig a hole. These became my rootstock. Then I gathered signwood from the old trees in the neighborhood and top worked my seedlings. Amazingly enough, they did pretty well. I was getting excited. A friend introduced me to the apple ladder. Then I discovered the bushel box and the picking bucket, more great tools. Although I did have contemporaries who were into this too, I desperately needed more information and stimulation. So I attended the occasional commercial orchard meeting and sat in the back where I hoped I'd be invisible. Everyone else was old enough to be my dad. There were, of course, as you might imagine, no women back then. Occasionally the subject of heirloom apples came up. The varieties that I was falling in love with. The commercial growers were not kind. Get rid of every one of them. They're not worth anything. They're trash. I said nothing. But I did wonder to myself, why would those brilliant farmers of days gone by, these farmers who had cleared the fields with oxen and stone boats, who had, with no USDA or cooperative extension or land grant universities, created magnificent farms that sustained families for generations. Why on earth would they, of all people, select and graft and pass down for centuries worthless apples? There was definitely something wrong with this equation, and I decided that someday I would figure out what it was. What was clear to me was that many of the apples I was finding were not anything you'd want to eat fresh. They did taste strange. I also knew enough about Maine history by that time to know that for generations, most Mainers worked on the farm or in the woods nearby. The noonday meal was called dinner. My neighbors still called it dinner, even when it was eaten from a lunchbox. which they called their dinner pail or dinner bucket. A lunch, on the other hand, was something that you ate between meals or later on in the evening, a snack. Dinner was a sit-down meal. The food came from the farm, and that included apples. The meal was cooked, including the apples. So it dawned on me, time to start cooking apples. My next step was to get my chef friend to teach me to make a simple, passable, decent crust. One that would allow me to learn what happens to apples when they are baked. I wanted to learn about the fruit. I also began to eat oatmeal and applesauce 5 or 6 mornings a week from September to June. Pies and sauce are just 2 of the traditional cooking ways of cooking apples, but they provided me the answer I was looking for. Most of these old cultivars were never selected to be eaten fresh in the first place. They were selected for pies, sauce, butter, cake, bread, dried, molasses, cider, and so forth and so on. The pie crust cooks in 60 minutes, 15 at 375 and 45 at 350. To be a perfect pie apple, it must conform to that timeline. Not many do. Some come out rubbery, while others turn to soup. Not enough acid, and they can actually taste horrible. If the timing is right, however, the best apples will be flavorful and of a perfect texture after 60 minutes in the oven. The cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, not to mention the sugar, are practically superfluous. The best sauce apples, on the other hand, cook quickly into a rich, creamy, slightly acidic sauce. I could get up, light the cook stove, make my oatmeal, select half a dozen apples from the root cellar, slice them up, put them in a saucepan with a little bit of water, and voila, they'd be perfect about the time the oatmeal was ready. No spices, no sugar, no canning, no freezing, just fresh apples all winter long from the root cellar. No wonder so many of these old apple varieties taste so weird. They were never meant to be eaten raw. Try eating a raw potato. Feeling vindicated and ready for action in 1982, I began to think about starting a nursery catalog, one that would focus on trees hardy in the coldest areas of the US. The ultimate goal would be to get these locally adapted varieties back into yards and commercial orchards where they belonged. This would be my chance, my opportunity to save the old timers by getting them back into action. Or was it my responsibility? That first year, the Fedco catalog, the Fedco tree catalog, the seeds catalog, if you know it, was a couple years earlier, was a couple of sheets of paper stapled in the corner with a list of fruit trees and a few ornamentals. I propagated nothing myself. I bought all the plants from a handful of nurseries who allowed me to order the trees in the summer and then adjust the quantities around New Year's when our sales were all in. In the first spring, a small group of us processed 70 orders. Fedco trees had begun. The premise of Fedco trees was to provide woody plants hardy to the northeast quarter of the US. We've also had customers in Western North Carolina, you know that area, mountainous. Also some places in Colorado where the climate is sort of vaguely similar to the Northeast. Some places in New Mexico, even as we have some customers outside San Diego in the mountains out there, but mostly the Northeast. I figured that there should be small nurseries all over the country, ones for the South, one for the Midwest. You know, the national catalog doesn't make sense to me. It should be regional. The catalog would provide accurate information. No meaningless, superlatives or fluff about the plants that we offered. We would speak to the intelligence of the customers. We would do the research that many of them don't have time for. They will see, we hoped, that we were telling it like it was. We would partner with our customers as we all plant more trees. With Fedco trees beginning to develop, I now spent more and more time exploring Maine for historic apples and other interesting plants. Within a couple of years, we began to propagate and offer what we considered to be the best of our discoveries. A few years later, I began to read about the trips to Kazakhstan, to the primordial apple forests. I desperately wanted to go. But Fedco trees ran on a tiny budget, and I had no credentials anyway. I was an English major. Then one day it occurred to me that what I was doing in Maine was already far more valuable than anything I could do or learn in Kazakhstan. Maine had numerous ancient cultivars, many of which originated in the state that were about to be lost forever. Many might already be gone. I had begun to wonder if anybody cared about those trees. The last of them looked so forlorn. I could hear them saying, "Please, kind sir, help us." My life, meanwhile, had become a continual apple exploration adventure. And not only was I loving it, but already I had discovered several old cultivars that hadn't been known about for decades. I could spend the rest of my life exploring the state of Maine and never run out of stuff to do. Maybe I didn't need to go to Kazakhstan after all. Maybe I didn't need to leave the state. Maybe my work was all right here in my own backyard. Perhaps the ancient trees were speaking to me, like the Persian apple tree of Hafiz, an opportunity, a responsibility. So my strategy became to focus on those varieties that were historically grown in Maine. I assembled lists of lost names, as well as detailed descriptions of the nameless I was finding and hoping to identify. I made wanted posters alive. There's one over there. And I put them up in the post office next to the FBI list, or, on the corner store of the town where I thought I might find that old variety. Then in about 1990, I did my first apple variety display at the Fedco tent at the huge Common Ground Fair. That's this fair here, which is, you should go someday if you haven't gone. It's really terrific. And the first display was about 50 apples, whatever I could find. And it turned out to be a big hit. People loved it. It was a magnet that sucked people in. The display got bigger and bigger every year. And before long, people were bringing me their apples to the fair in hopes that I would identify them. They were bringing me apples I'd never seen before. I realized that this could be a wonderful trade. I was being brought apples from all over the state that I would never be able to find on my own. In return, I was going to have to promise to learn to identify them. It seemed like a good trade for everyone. So now I had to train myself to distinguish between seedlings and grafted trees. In Maine, there are tens of thousands of seedlings. You can find them along almost every road, stream, stone wall, abandoned field, even along the ocean shore. So many of the apples brought to me had no names. People they didn't know. So distinguishing from seedlings and grafted trees actually is relatively easy to do, but you have to be willing to take the time. It requires seeing hundreds of each and understanding what it is you're looking at, listening to them, I guess you could say. Before the days of digital cameras and email, I would often get in the car and drive hours to many places just to see the trees, to see whether it was a seedling or not. These days, I still travel, but a lot less, more targeted. Now I ask for the photo first of the tree. I don't even care about the photo of the fruit. From the photo, I can usually tell whether or not it's a seedling. Sorry, no name. You get to name it. But I can also tell the approximate age of the tree, which turns out from the photo, which turns out to also help inform the variety's identity. If you know when a tree was planted, you know that different varieties, different cultivars were typically planted at different time periods. So my love of apples forced me to learn to identify cultivars phenotypically. And it also simultaneously propelled me into the history of Maine, the history of New England, and the history of the world. I was increasingly finding apples I'd never seen before or seemed endangered. I collected the signwood and top worked them onto our trees at home. 5, 10, 15 varieties on a tree. Not only did this allow me to save them, it also gave me the opportunity to generate signwood, as well as to observe, study, and eat the fruit. It became clear to me that I was involved in a race against time. Already, many trees were being lost, and our farm was becoming a library of endangered, and in some cases, unique plant material. But I was also running out of room in our teeny woodland farm for all these varieties I was collecting. I needed more space. I began to dream of creating a public orchard to protect the historic apples of Maine. I considered working with the state, but decided against it for various reasons I won't go into. My wife and I discussed starting our own nonprofit, but in the end, we decided to enter into a partnership with the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, that's fair, MAFGA. I'll take a quick little break here and tell you that many of the apple varieties that we found, they did not originate in Maine. They were imported. Baldwin, Northern Spy, Roxbury Russet, Rhode Island Greening, you know the names. But many originated in Maine. And these are 16 apples. Maine has 16 counties. These are 16 apples that originated in each of these counties. And I was bored one winter, and my wife was going to meetings for work at night. And so I thought, I'll paint a picture. And I thought, well, what shall I paint? Well, how about some apples? Well, there's, if you have Dan Bussey's book, there's, 17,000 apples in it. So, you could flip the page and point if you wanted. But I decided, well, why not an apple from each of Maine's 16 counties that originated there? So this is Black Oxford that I should have brought 50 Black Oxford. I could have given you each one. It really is that color. And these are the others here from all the 16 counties of Maine. If I was in New York, I'd be in trouble because there's about 70 counties in New York. How many counties in Colorado? Ooh, shame on you. Do we know? Does anybody know? 64? Wow, yeah, that's a big t-shirt. So I'd have to be a shoot. So somebody told me once, we're talking about that there was a young woman, I don't remember her name, and she was applying for a job in New York that had nothing to do with geography. And she got to her interview, and the person said, how many counties in New York? And she knew, whatever it is, 73 or something. And she said, and he hired her right then. So learn your counting. So anyway, so in 2012, 10 years ago, we founded the Maine Heritage Orchard at MAFGA's headquarters in Unity. The orchard established a 10-acre fenced-in site for preservation, research, and education. We planted the first 100 trees 2 years later in April 2014. Now, 10 years after its inception, the collection holds about 350 varieties of historic apples and pears we've discovered around the state. At this point, many of the original source trees have died. And were it not for that orchard, many cultivars would be gone forever. The main heritage orchard began as a volunteer project. We did what we could and paid as we went. As soon as we could afford it, we hired an orchard manager and eventually a small seasonal staff. Funding has been endlessly challenging, but we've been able to keep it going. We plan to eventually endow the orchard. That has remained elusive thus far, but we're convinced of the value of the project, and you should be of your project. And at some point, we'll find the funds. It's work worth doing. We have one tree of each variety in our collection. Some of these we've identified, while others we've just provisionally named them for now. We've also developed what we call the stewardship program, in which we provide trees to homeowners who hold backups of the rarest material in the case that one of our trees fails, and we've already had to use that program. Our stewardship program is like an insurance policy. It also gets more of these old varieties back into circulation. Many selections have also made it into the Fedco catalog, if you know Fedco, I was talking about it, as trees or scionwood. We want to make this plant material available to folks everywhere. Some is even now in commercial orchards in Maine. Some of them whose dads or grandfathers poo-pooed their heirlooms long ago. One of my friends who has a big commercial orchard in Maine once told me, he'd never grow black Oxford, and now he's got a big block of them. And I snicker every time I'm over there. We've also begun to work with Cameron Peace, Dr. Cameron Peace at Washington State University, to DNA profile our entire collection. This has led to all sorts of revelations. It's been a great partnership. The main heritage orchard and all this work to save rare plant material has been both an opportunity and a responsibility. Two words I think about fairly often when I'm out in the gardens or in the orchards. I find myself using the two words interchangeably. Sometimes I'm not even sure if I know the difference between the two. An opportunity is typically defined as a chance, an occasion, a circumstance, as in, this is your opportunity to listen to a concerned apple tree. This is your chance to respond. I suppose that an opportunist really should be a good thing, although it's often associated with those who fail to see the gift of circumstance as a chance to contribute. Responsibility is defined as an obligation or requirement. You better listen to that tree. Or even worse, as blame, fault, liability, or just plain guilt. Oh, look what you've done. You failed to save those old Maine apples, and now they're gone forever. It's your fault. I'd like to extract guilt and liability from responsibility, and in doing so, suggest a way of looking at both opportunity and responsibility and how they might relate to our brief time on Earth. I like to think of responsibility as the ability or the capacity to respond, as in response ability or response able. As such, becomes a gift and a skill rather than an obligation. That puts the word in the realm of the possible and the positive. I hear the call. I have the good fortune to be able to respond. I have been given the chance, the opportunity, in which if I am responsible, in other words, if I have developed the intention and the skills, I join the ranks of those who can and will act. It can be a small thing, like seeing the old orchard dying and putting together a plan to replant it, using the cuttings from the old trees themselves, and then getting the neighbors together and having a big community planting day, kids and all. But why should I bother? Don't we have much bigger fish to fry? Aren't there more important things to do in the world? We need not be deterred by what seem to be small things. Pete Seeger, the famous old folk singer, liked to sing, "Many stones will form an arch, singly none, singly none. Drops of water turn the mill, singly none, singly none." Though each drop does turn the mill an infinitesimal amount, it is only the totality of the effort of all those drops that the mill is turned. The corn is ground, the apples become pumice, ready for the press. The orchard is saved, the world is changed. Was saving old apples that often few other people seem to even care about? My opportunity, my chance to do something? Or was it my responsibility and obligation? Does it even matter how I frame it? Might it only be better that I listen and then act? I saw it and I did it. But then, did it really change anything? I would be willing to guess that most people driving down the roads of Maine don't even notice the apple trees. Oh, really? Were there apple trees there? Who cares about a few apple trees anyway? And I would guess that even those who do notice the trees might not care about who did it. Which brings up the word credit. Credit, acclaim, and especially fame are all overrated. In fact, I would say they are all irrelevant. Who invented rope anyway? Who invented the boat and the bowl and the wheel and the knife and the root cellar and the apple ladder? Over the centuries, some do nothing and get heaps of credit. Some contribute nothing and get lots of fame. Many do much and get no credit at all. They are the anonymous ones who do the work and change the world. Who did graft those old apple trees scattered on the lawns of the old farms in Maine or Massachusetts or Boulder, Colorado? And who planted the ancient apple trees I climb, the ones that inspired me, whose fruit I picked and cooked into the sauce that sustains me and my family? No one alive knows who grafted my favorite trees. Those anonymous grafters of the past are long gone. And yet the trees are still here. Someone grafted them, someone planted them. The grafter did not ask to be credited. The grafter grafts for the love of the opportunity. The grafter responds to the call. The old trees will die someday, we know that. They offer us a chance to take the twig and pass it along. The grafter sees the need, seizes the opportunity, and responds. The grafter is responsible. Drops of water turn the mill. The plants speak. The world calls. We respond. It's a song of call and response. If we know what to do, we reply, we act. If we do not know what to do, we learn. We find the mentor. We learn to listen. We learn the words. We are shown the knife and how to sharpen it. We learn when to cut the scion wood. We learn how to store the scion wood so that it will be green and alive when we take the knife in May and slice the graft. The old tree says, I am old. If you believe in me, take this opportunity. Take the scion from my branch, graft it, and pass it on as a gift to those in the future who you will never know. Be the anonymous purveyor of the best of the past. Help to create the future as those have done before you. The apple tree grafter is like the baton passer in the relay race. In the world of apples, the baton is the scion. The scion is the twig from the old tree. The grafter takes the scion and grafts that scion onto the new rootstock. In doing so, the old variety is passed on to the new generation. The best of the past leads us into the future. Is this the grafter's opportunity or responsibility? Perhaps it is the grafter's opportunity to accept the responsibility. In that case, it is an honor to be the baton passer. We are the baton passers. The baton passer is the torchbearer. John Lennon said in an interview just before his death, we're carrying the torch, like the Olympic torch, passing it hand to hand to each other, to each country, to each generation. That's our job. Note that John Lennon said, we're carrying the torch. That's our job. That's the first person plural. I do not carry the torch. We carry the torch. I cannot graft all the trees. We all need to graft the trees. Many stones will build the arch, singly none. One small act of doing something that most people will never know about or even notice if they do happen to drive by. But then someday, someone does notice. Maybe one person notices. Maybe someone you will never know sees the tree that you plant, the baton that you pass, and it changes them forever. Meanwhile, Cammie, my wife, and I are still on our farm. Our daughters and their husbands and our grandchildren are scattered across the continent, like the children of many of our friends. We've had dozens of apprentices on our farm with us over the years. Maybe one of you is going to come someday. We're in central Maine. We're nice. Some are farming on their own now, years later. You are the future. And we're honored to be their mentors. We still grow most of our own food. We cook and heat the house with wood that we cut on our land. We have a few hundred fruit trees and a small nursery at our place. We focus on varieties that we've gotten to love over the years, heirlooms, as well as some more interesting recent introductions. We also start apples from seeds most year. They are our children too. We do a rare apple CSA, offering unusual varieties we grow, as well as many grown by friends in the area. It's yet another way to introduce high quality apples that might otherwise be overlooked, while at the same time supporting growers who take a chance and grow odd varieties that might otherwise go unsold just because people are unfamiliar with them. In the winter, we host a wassail on our farm on a cold winter night in January, celebrating the apple tree, completing one year and starting the next. It's a circle we plunge into deeper and deeper as the years go by. Being with plants is an endless process of learning to listen to them and how best to serve the universe. I'll close with a few words from Merlin, the enchanter, wise man, and sometimes magician from King Arthur's time. This is paraphrased here from Alfred Lord Tennyson, an English poet. Here's Merlin. I was once out looking for a magic weed I think he was out on an herb walk. I was once out looking for magic weed, and I found a fair young squire who sat alone. He had carved himself a knightly shield of wood and was painting on it fancied arms and an eagle with the words, "I follow fame." And speaking not, but leaning over him, I took his paintbrush and I blotted out the bird. And I painted a gardener putting in a graft with this for a motto: rather use than fame. You should have seen him blush, but afterwards he made a stalwart knight. Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah, go. Yeah.
Just want a round of thanks again to John. Call out, thanks to the students, 1250, and the amazing posters you did. Thank you so much. To Sam and Terry and Amy and Deidre and for organizing this event. Thanks so much. For doing basically the full darn deal in terms of the cures. Yeah, I think there's time if people can stay to have a conversation with John, right? This is a great time. If you need to go, I think that's okay too.
Sure, thank you. If
so-
you need to go, yeah.
Whatever works best, but please, yeah, we can open it up for questions and conversation. And again, thanks so much, John, for coming so far away and sharing.
Yeah, I'll also
Beautiful.
say, thank you all for coming, and all these people here know how to get in touch with me, and if you want to send me an email or whatever, please be in touch. And if you ever come to Maine, come see us, or certainly go to MOFCA and go see the Heritage Orchard. You're also welcome to come visit us as well. So if you have some questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. So fire away if you do.
And just one more thing.
Oh,
For
yeah.
the applications, 1250 students, a picture before you're allowed to leave. Okay, we have it every year and it's really important to us.
And if you'll let me join you, I'll be in your
Yeah,
business.
so let's have some questions and then make sure.
Yeah, do you have any questions?
Sorry, I forgot that.
Yeah.
Yes. Is that just during the fall and all, after the summer as well? When's it?
Okay, so the question is about, what about internships and apprentices and things? Yeah, well, MOFCA does have a apprentice program, a very official program. And if you just went to mofca.org, you could find out about it. And if you have more specific questions about the Maine Heritage Orchard or about what we do, get in touch with me personally. You can do that through, through Lisa and Amy and, anybody, your teachers or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Yeah. And you got the award for the best sweater today. So it's way better than this, but I'm thoroughly like class. I love this sweater. But anyway, we think we found a way back. So stay tuned. Yeah. Other questions? Anybody else? Yeah, in the back.
You talked about how many of the old varieties that you were buying were for cooking. They're better cooking.
Yeah.
And is that true in general? Do you think of, is that more specific because of, the long winters that may, surely people offer more variety that it would also just eat, but I'm wondering.
Well, that's so the question is about, in general, the use of heirlooms, we'll say. As we get into the 20th century, we slowly but surely begin to discard the culinary apples, if you want to call them that, and begin to focus more and more on the dessert apple. And then you have this word cull, which the culls become the culinary apples of the 21st century. You take whatever you got that you don't want, you send it to a factory, they make it into a pie and put it in your freezer case at your grocery store, and who knows what apples are in it. And they've been so processed by that point, probably doesn't even matter anymore. So you wind up having apples that are being used for culinary purposes are just discarded dessert apples. But my guess is, I mean, I'd have to look at the list of what the first apples, my guess is the first apples that were grown in Colorado were probably at least half also culinary apples. Or as we say, all-purpose apples, apples that were good for cooking and also good for fresh eating. But also these old apples, some of them, I mean, we have these apples that are called sweet apples, which are essentially devoid of acidity. So they taste completely bizarre to our modern palate. And they were coveted. In fact, if you look at an old list of apples, you have Tolman sweet, pound sweet, pumpkin sweet. That sweet is not used to entice you to eat them fresh. It was a word that indicated this is one of those low acid apples that you use for very specific purposes, like making molasses or feeding livestock that don't like acidic fruit, and so forth and so on. So some apples almost exclusively for baking. Now they could be used for other things, but if you want to bake an apple, and now I don't mean a pie, I mean like whole, then two in particular, one is an old Massachusetts apple, blue pear Maine, another one maybe what's grown out here, Wolf River. You can bake that whole, and in an hour it won't fall apart, and you wind up with mush all over your baking dish. So very, very specific uses, many of these. And one time I met a woman whose grandmother had an orchard of 12 trees, and each tree was used only for a specific purpose by her grandmother. And she would be mortified to use, this one for that or that one for this. So they knew a lot. These were, very, very thoughtful, brilliant people.
What's your favorite fresh eating?
Well, so you don't have grandchildren yet, I know. And so it's like asking, what's my favorite grandchild? I have one, but I don't tell. And also everybody's palate is different. I think the famous Geneva pomologist Louis High Bailey, who was the genius of plants, he said, there's a wonderful quote by him, you probably look up, that he talks about how fantastic it is that there's so many varieties because everybody's mouth is different. And that's really, you got to just try everything you can find and you'll find something. And chances are the one you love the best, I wouldn't. And maybe even your friends don't. Some of the ones that I really like, some of my friends they like, really? So. Another question or two? Yeah.
Could you speak to the keeping policies so much times that are particularly favored throughout the future is something you always look for, or is it more what we behave when we.
Well, so the question is about root cellars and use. So because I've been doing this quite a while, I've developed favorites from every season. So and my favorite thing to do is actually make applesauce because you can eat a lot of apples as applesauce. If you're, if you're into it, you find it. You eat meat, it goes great with meat. I eat it with oatmeal. You can eat it with all sorts of stuff. And certain apples in the root cellar are actually one of the most famous American heirlooms is Roxbury russet. And some of my friends really poo-poo it. They don't like it. But as an applesauce apple it is, and it will keep in July in a root cellar, and it's phenomenal. A sauce apple, I think that's where it's its best. One of the modern apples that I love, and it also keeps really well. That keeps really well, and it makes great sauce and pies and anything cooked is Redfield. And there's a big thing about red fleshed apples these days, there's a lot of hoopla around it. Redfield is a red fleshed apple. It's large, it's not small like a lot of red fleshed apples. It's about the size of a, Macintosh, Macintosh, that's a one you see everywhere in use. It keeps well, and it just cooks, beautifully. Many of the classic winter storage apples, Northern Spy, Baldwin, Stark, Mildon, those are four of the eastern ones. I'm not really sure how much. We don't grow Jonathan up in the Northeast, but Jonathan's very, very popular around here. That these are mostly all-purpose apples, which means that they don't necessarily excel. Northern Spy is quite a good pie apple. They don't necessarily excel at anything, but they're really good at a bunch of stuff. So, and they keep really well. So, any other questions?
We have one question from the chat, and the questioner was asking if you were reading from one of your books, and if you were, which book should they go to learn more?
Well, I actually, obviously, I did read my talk. I give quite a few talks, and in the fall, maybe 6, 12, or 15 or something. Most of them are to the Hodunk Historical Society, and there's 8 people there, or the Garden Club of Waterville, and there's 5 people there, or whatever. So sometimes I always read up on where I am because I want to talk about their apples, and their thing. If I'm doing something that I consider to be, it's all important, but we'll say a little more important. I know there's going to be more people there today. I always do something different. I never gave this talk before. So I think about what it is I want to say, and then I start from scratch. So a lot of stuff I said today, I've said before in one form or another. There's only so many things you can say, but I want, and for those of you that think that someday you might be so crazy as to do what I do and stand up in front of people, I would say that having something that if you get up and stand in front of people who you've never talked to before, and you say the same thing you've always said, they will know. And they may not know consciously, but they'll know. So your job, my job, is to tell you something that I think maybe hasn't been said, or maybe you'd like to hear. I'm just guessing because, of course, I know Amy pretty well from the last couple of years, but all the rest of you, I don't know you, so I'm just guessing. But what I'm trying to do is come up with something that I thought maybe, would mean something to you. So that's the long answer to that person to say, no, it's not in my book. So that's why you have to read the book, you say, so what you can get, and if you buy it online, and we have a website too, there's moffitt.org. You can go to fedproceeds.com, but we also, my wife and I have a website, which is outonalimbapples.com. And you can buy my book there, and I'll sign it for no extra cost. And I do little drawings and all sorts of stuff. So it's really worth the money. So, yeah. So if you're interested in even just learning more about what I do, I'll try to answer your emails. You can go to Adeline Apples, you can go to AdelineApples.com, or just, get in touch with the people that ran the conference here today, and they'll get you in touch with me. And then we can talk more. So, yeah, and even if if you're thinking of apprenticing in, New Zealand, I might be able to help you. So I'm happy to, if you're interested, there's people out, I wouldn't be here now, except that I have people who just gave it to me. And that's the whole thing about the drops of water turning mill, saying we're none. This is only gonna work if we take it where we can get it and give it back, and so that's how it works. And that is how it works. It's how it did work, and it's how it will work. So, anybody else? Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And I will make this recording available on the website, hopefully by this weekend. I hope you all had a wonderful time with us today, and thank you for joining us.